The shovel hit the earth before Matthew Garrett even reached the fence line. He had crested the ridge above the south field at dawn, expecting to find the same thing he had found every morning for 5 years running: dry, cracked soil baking under an indifferent Texas sky. The furrows his father had carved with his own hands slowly filling back in with dust and memory. He had expected silence. He had expected the particular kind of emptiness that had kept him away from this field through 5 whole planting seasons, through 5 whole springs when every other acre of Garrett land bloomed and bore fruit except this one. What he had not expected was Theresa Alden. She was already 50 yards into the field when he spotted her. The morning light caught the swing of her arm as she drove the spade into the ground with a force that would have surprised most men twice her size. She was not testing the soil or scratching at its surface the way someone unfamiliar with honest labor might. She was planting with intention, deep, measured, methodical, moving, in a line so straight it might have been drawn with a surveyor's instrument. She had already worked through a third of the south field, and the evidence of her labor was staggering. The earth behind her was turned and opened and breathing for the first time in half a decade. Matthew's chest locked up so tight he could not draw a breath. She had no right. She had no business being on this land in this field with her hands in this particular soil. She did not know what this field was. She did not know what it held. She did not know why he had locked the gate to the south pasture 5 seasons ago and never opened it again, why he had let the weeds creep in from the eastern boundary and the irrigation channel silt over until it was barely a crease in the ground. She did not know about the morning in April of 1878 when he had found his father on this very ground, not planting, not harvesting, but lying still between the rows with his eyes open to the sky. She did not know any of that, but he was going to make sure she stopped. He came down off the ridge at a pace that was almost a run, his boots throwing up small clouds of dust as he crossed the fence stile without breaking stride, his jaw set, his hands already clenched at his sides with a combination of fury and something else, something dangerously close to the raw ache of grief that he had sealed behind a locked gate along with the field itself. Stop. The word came out harder than he intended. It came out like a command, like a wall, and Theresa straightened up from the earth with the kind of unhurried composure that told him this was not the first time someone had shouted a single word at her and expected the world to rearrange itself accordingly. She turned to face him. She was holding the spade with both hands, blade down, completely unrattled. Her dark hair was pinned back but coming loose at the temples from the exertion. Her eyes, clear and dark and utterly unafraid, moved over him the way an experienced rancher surveys new terrain. "Good morning," she said. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" "Planting winter wheat," she said. "The soil has been fallow long enough that it should be nitrogen-rich. The moisture content is better than I expected. If the irrigation channel can be reopened by the end of this week, this field could yield enough to cover your northern pasture's shortfall and still leave surplus for the granary." He stared at her. She looked back at him with absolute calm and waited. And in the space of that silence, something happened to Matthew Garrett that had not happened to him since before his father died. The wall he had built around himself cracked, just slightly, just enough for the cold air of everything he had been hiding to rush through. Because she was right about the soil. She was right about the nitrogen content. She was right about the yield potential, and the fact that she could stand in a field she had never worked before and read the earth that read it better than he had been able to for 5 years because grief had blinded him to everything. This soil was still capable of becoming hit him somewhere south of the ribs like a fist. He still did not want her here, but he could not quite form the words to make her leave. 3 weeks earlier, Theresa Alden had arrived in Caldwell County, Texas, on a Wednesday afternoon in March of 1883, aboard a stage that was running 2 hours late, and had lost a wheel twice between the station at San Antonio and the stop at Garrison's Creek. She had ridden the last 4 miles sitting on the driver's bench beside old Pete Harlow, because the inside of the coach had developed a rattling that she correctly identified as a cracked axle housing, and she had not felt like dying in a runaway carriage before she had even seen the town. Garrison's Creek was not much to look at. There was a main street that was really just a wide dirt lane with ambitions, a general store run by a man named Colville who charged fair prices and kept decent records, a livery stable, a blacksmith's shop, a small church that the Methodists and the Presbyterians shared on alternating Sundays, and a saloon that the town's 3 founding families had argued about the necessity of for 12 straight years, and had ultimately lost the argument against. The population was somewhere around 300 people, depending on which ranches were in from the outlying spreads, and it sat in a bowl of reddish-brown hill country that was beautiful in a spare, unsparing way that demanded a particular kind of person to find it so. Theresa Alden was that particular kind of person. She had come from Missouri, from a family that had farmed the same plot of land outside Kirksville for 3 generations. Her father, James Alden, had been the kind of farmer who treated agriculture the way some men treated religion, with a ferocious, studied devotion that saw him reading every agricultural journal he could get his hands on, corresponding with experimental stations in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and passing every scrap of that accumulated knowledge directly to Theresa, his eldest child, and as he had told her plainly when she was 14, his sharpest one. She had grown up knowing the difference between alluvial and less soil, understanding crop rotation and soil chemistry at a time when most farmers in the region still relied on inherited habit and hope. She could read a field's condition from its color and texture, identify disease in corn at 100 yards, and coax yields from land that other farmers had written off as spent. Her father had died in the autumn of 1882, leaving the Missouri farm to her younger brother Daniel, who had a wife and 3 children, and a right to it that Theresa had never disputed. What the farm's succession had left her with was the quiet realization that she had no particular reason to stay in Missouri, that the knowledge she carried was not dependent on any single piece of ground, and that the Texas frontier was advertising land opportunities in every newspaper from St. Louis to Memphis. What had specifically drawn her to Caldwell County was a small notice in the Garrison's Creek Gazette, placed by a land agent named Horace Finley, advertising shares in an agricultural cooperative scheme that Finley claimed would bring 40,000 acres of underused ranchland into productive cultivation. Theresa had corresponded with Finley for 2 months before making the journey, and by the time she arrived, she had a clearer picture of the county's agricultural potential than most people who had been living there for years. What she had not anticipated was that Finley was a fraud. She discovered this on her second day in Garrison's Creek when she visited the land office and found that the parcels Finley had been marketing belonged to active existing claims, several of which were held by a ranching operation called the Garrett Spread, nearly 6,000 acres of rangeland and dryland farm that had been built by a man named Samuel Garrett over 30 years and was now being run, somewhat erratically according to county gossip, by his son, Matthew Garrett, age 31, single, owner of the largest operating ranch in the county, and from what Theresa could gather from her conversations at Colville's store, and from the spare, angular way the townspeople talked about him, a man who had been not quite right since his father's death 5 years back. Theresa had dealt with Finley's fraud the way she dealt with most obstacles, which was with a directness that left no room for ambiguity. She had walked into his office, laid her correspondence on his desk, and informed him that she would be reporting his scheme to the county land office and the circuit judge, unless he returned every cent he had collected under false pretenses from every correspondent he had deceived. Finley had blustered and threatened. Theresa had picked up her correspondence, folded it neatly into her bag, and told him she would see him at the land office the following morning. He had paid out by that evening. The money she recovered was enough to rent a small house on the eastern edge of town and to keep herself comfortable for perhaps 6 months. It was not enough to buy land, and without land, the expertise she had carried across 3 states was theoretical. She had been thinking about this problem for a week and a half when she first laid eyes on the Garrett South field. She had ridden out that way on a morning when the light was particularly clear, following the county road that ran along the western edge of the Garrett spread, and she had stopped her horse at the ridge overlooking the south field and felt the same thing she always felt when she looked at underused land, a kind of professional heartbreak, a farmer's grief at potential wasted. The soil color was visible even from the road, that deep reddish-brown with a faint undertone of black that told a person who knew how to read it that the earth was rich, was rested, was waiting. She had asked around about the south field. The answers she got were vague and uncomfortable, the way answers get when a whole town knows something painful about someone and has agreed without discussion to leave it alone. She learned only that the field had belonged to old Samuel Garrett's special project, that he had been the one who first broke it from native grassland and had planted it himself for years, and that since his death it had not been touched. She had spent 2 days thinking about what to do with that information. On the morning of the 3rd day, she had loaded her rented horse with seed bags, borrowed a spade from the livery stable, and ridden out to the south field at first light. She had not known that her presence would hit Matthew Garrett like a physical blow. She had known, in a general way, that she was doing something that required permission she had not obtained. She had told herself that results would speak louder than trespass, that if she could show what the field was capable of, it would open a conversation she could not otherwise initiate. She had not fully accounted for the grief that would be standing on the other side of that conversation. Matthew stood in the turned earth and looked at her, and the fury was still in his face, but it was losing its clean shape, becoming complicated by something she recognized because she had worn it herself in the autumn after her father died. She recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting on someone else's letter. "My father died in this field," he said. It came out flat. Not a confession, not an explanation, just a fact that he apparently needed her to have before anything else. Theresa held his gaze and did not look away and did not offer hollow words of sympathy and did not make the mistake of turning this into a moment of her own. "I know he's gone," she said carefully. "I did not know it was here." Matthew looked down at the turned earth between them and something moved through his face that was too complex to name. "I can stop," she said. "If you want me to stop, I will stop." He was quiet for a long time. The morning light stretched out across the field between them, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was making its clear, rising call, and the smell of opened earth was so strong it was almost a presence of its own. "How far along is the irrigation channel?" he asked. It was not the question she had expected. It took her a half-second to recalibrate. "The main channel is silted in for about 60 feet near the eastern intake. After that it looks intact. I can have it cleared in 2 days with the right tools." He looked at her then with an expression she could not read entirely: disbelief, assessment, something that might have been the first thin edge of reluctant respect. "Who are you?" he asked. "Theresa Alden. I have been renting the Dawson house on Oak Street for 11 days. "Why are you in my field, Theresa Alden?" "Because the field needed it," she said, and meant it without apology. Matthew Garrett did not send her away that morning. He stood in the south field for a long time looking at the turned rows behind her, and then he walked the eastern boundary and looked at the irrigation channel intake, and then he stood at the spot where his father had died. She understood that was what the spot was by the way he stopped there, by the way his whole body changed, and he stood there for a while before he walked back to where she was waiting. "The seed," he said. "What did you plant?" "Hard red winter wheat. I brought 4 bushels. There is enough seed left for the western quarter of the field if the soil holds as consistent as I think it will." "Where did you get hard red winter wheat in Garrison's Creek?" "I did not get it in Garrison's Creek. I brought it from Missouri." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was the clearest she had seen from him, yet direct, sharp, the expression of a man whose mind was working without the obstruction of grief for the first time in a while. "The northern pastures alfalfa crop is struggling," he said. It was not exactly an invitation, but it was not a dismissal either. "I noticed," she said. "The soil there is showing signs of compaction." A deep-tined aeration followed by a cover crop rotation would restore it within 2 seasons. You could interseed with crimson clover this spring without losing the alfalfa stand. Matthew Garrett was quiet again. Then, without another word, he walked to the eastern fence, pulled a post digger out of the grass where it had apparently been lying for some time, and walked it back to the irrigation channel intake. He began to clear the silt. She went back to her planting. They worked in silence for most of that morning, and it was the kind of silence that grows between people who are both comfortable with labor, who understand that work is its own form of communication. Theresa worked her way down the rows with a consistency that was almost mechanical in its evenness, and she was aware of Matthew's presence at the periphery of the field the whole time, the rhythm of his digging a kind of counterpoint to her own. Around mid-morning he straightened from the channel and looked at her across the rows. "You know soil chemistry," he said. It was not a question. "My father was a serious farmer. He made sure I was too." Matthew turned something over in his expression that she could not quite see the underside of. "Colville said a woman had turned up in town after Finley's scheme, said she got her money back. I did. Finley hasn't left town yet." "He will," Theresa said simply. "People like Finley always move on when there's nothing left to take." Matthew made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Not quite, but almost. Most people in this county are afraid of Finley. He has friends in unpleasant places." "I have no patience for unpleasant places," Theresa said, and drove her spade into the earth with a finality that seemed to close the subject. She rode back to town at noon, because she had obligations in the afternoon that she had already made. She was expected at the schoolhouse, where the teacher, a tired young man named Wick Prager, had asked her to speak to the older children about practical agriculture after she had mentioned her background to him at the general store. She had agreed without hesitation because she believed in the kind of knowledge that could be passed along, and because it gave her purpose in a town that had not yet decided what to do with her. She did not expect Matthew Garrett to send word to her the following morning. But he did through old Pete Harlow, who was apparently his connection to every piece of town information. The note was 3 lines. "The irrigation channel is clear. I have tools for the western quarter if you want to finish the field. Garrett." She wrote out the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning she arrived to find that Matthew had rebuilt the irrigation gate himself, overnight, working alone by the look of the fresh shavings around the post. It was a good gate, well hung, with proper stops on both sides and a proper drainage diversion that showed he knew what he was doing. She stood at it for a long time before she turned to find him watching her from 20 yards away. "You built irrigation gates before," she said. "My father and I built the original one on this channel together." He paused. "I was 11. She looked at the gate again. There was grief in his workmanship, she thought. There was love in it. "It is very well made," she said. He nodded once and came forward with a bundle of seed bags over his shoulder, and they worked the western quarter of the field together that day. And it was on that day that something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but the way a season shifts, the way you notice one morning that the air is different and know, without being told, that something has fundamentally changed. He began asking her questions about her methods, practical questions with a farmer's precision, about timing, about seeding depth, about her assessment of the soil's mineral content, about how she planned to manage the irrigation schedule as the season progressed. She answered everything directly and thoroughly, and he listened in the way that people who are genuinely intelligent listen, which is without the need to insert themselves into the answer. She started asking him questions too, about the ranch, about what he had been managing and how, about the northern pasture's history and the grazing rotation he had been using. She was building a picture, and he seemed to understand this, and he answered with the same directness she offered him. What emerged from those conversations over the following days was something that surprised her. Matthew Garrett was not a man who had let his ranch go out of ignorance or laziness. He was an excellent rancher who had continued to manage the cattle operation and the northern and eastern fields with competence and dedication through the full 5 years since his father's death. The south field was the only thing he had closed off, and the south field was not a farming decision. It was a grief decision. It was the sealed room, the locked drawer, the part of himself he had not been able to open. She began to understand this gradually, and as she understood it, she felt the particular tenderness that comes not from pity but from recognition. She had had her own sealed places after her father died. She had kept her father's agricultural journals in a box for 6 months before she could open them, because every page of his handwriting was a small version of losing him again. What she had not done, and could not have done, was seal off a field. The earth was too alive for that. You could not shut out something that was still breathing. By the end of the first week, the entire south field had been planted, and the irrigation channel was running clean and steady, and Theresa had drawn a planting schedule on a sheet of brown paper from Colville's store that accounted for rainfall probability, frost dates, and the field's microtopography. She had pinned it to the fence post at the field's entrance with a tack. Matthew had stood at the fence post reading it for a long time, and then he had folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket without a word. The following Tuesday, he found her at Colville's store around mid-afternoon, loading flour and dried beans into her saddlebag with the methodical efficiency she brought to every task. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hat in his hands, with an expression that was somewhere between determined and uncomfortable. "I need an honest conversation," he said. Colville disappeared into the back room with suspicious promptness. Theresa finished securing her saddlebag and turned to face him. "Then have one," she said. "You have been working my field for a week. You have spent your own seed and your own labor on my land. I have not compensated you, and I have not offered you any terms, and that is wrong." "It is," she agreed. "I would like to discuss terms." She studied him for a moment. His jaw was set in a way she had come to recognize as the outward manifestation of an inner deliberation. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. When he said he wanted terms, he meant something specific, and he was holding it back until he understood how the ground stood. "I need land," she said. "To own I cannot afford to buy, and you have no reason to sell. But I need ground to work, real ground, enough of it to prove what I know I can do. The south field," he said, "to start." Matthew looked at her with that sharp, direct look that she was becoming familiar with. "You are proposing a partnership." "I am proposing an arrangement where my labor and knowledge improve your yields and you provide land and infrastructure. We split the surplus above operating costs at a rate we agree upon. I would want 60 days to show you numbers that justify a 3-year agreement." Matthew was quiet. The store had the dusty, particular stillness of a Tuesday afternoon in a small frontier town. Somewhere outside a horse was moving its feet in the street. 60% of surplus for me, 40 for you, first season," he said. "After the first season, if your numbers hold, we renegotiate to even terms." It was not as favorable as she would have liked. It was also not unreasonable for a first agreement, and she respected that he had named specific terms rather than vague ones. "Done," she said. "I will want it in writing. I will have it drawn at the land office by Thursday." She put out her hand. He looked at it for half a second and then shook it, and his grip was firm and direct, and the calluses on his hand were a farmer's calluses as well as a rancher's, which told her something important about who he had been before grief had narrowed him. The written agreement was filed at the county land office on Thursday as he had said. Theresa kept her copy folded inside the same leather folio she used to carry her father's correspondence, and for reasons she did not examine closely at the time, this felt like the right place for it. Over the following weeks, the partnership became something the town of Garrison's Creek watched with open curiosity and considerable opinion. People had their views about a single woman working a man's land in a formal partnership, and they expressed those views with the freedom that small communities have always exercised. Martha Colville, the storekeeper's wife, told Theresa with genuine warmth that she thought it was the most sensible thing that had happened to the Garrett spread in years. The reverend at the Methodist side of the shared church expressed some concern, vaguely, in the direction of propriety. 3 of the neighboring ranchers' wives invited Theresa to a quilting circle specifically, she suspected, to get a clearer look at her. She went. She was not particularly skilled at quilting, which she acknowledged plainly, and she spent the afternoon answering questions about soil chemistry and crop rotation, while her stitching came out serviceable at best. She liked the women better for the directness of their curiosity, and she thought they liked her better for not pretending to be anything other than what she was. Horace Finley had not left town. Theresa had expected this, and she had also expected that a man like Finley, who had made a small industry of deceiving people and who had been forced to return money publicly, would have a particular kind of resentment for the person who had forced him to do so. She had been careful. She locked her door at night and she varied her routes. She was not frightened, but she was not naive. It was on a Friday evening in early April, about 3 weeks into her arrangement with Matthew, that Finley made his play. She had ridden back from the south field later than usual because she had been recalibrating the irrigation timing and the light had been good. She was watering her rented horse at the trough outside the livery, when 2 men she did not recognize stepped out of the narrow gap between the livery and the adjacent building. They were not polite about it. They told her that Finley wanted his money back, and that if she made things difficult, things would get difficult for her in the kind of way that was hard to explain to a circuit judge. Theresa assessed the situation with the same practical clarity she brought to a troubled field. 2 men, both larger than her, both emboldened by numbers and shadows, and the late hour when the main street was emptied out. She had a derringer in the pocket of her riding skirt, which she was not yet convinced she needed. She had also been taught by her father, who had been a man with a vivid appreciation for self-preservation, that the best response to a threat was to make the consequences of following through on it larger than the benefit. "Tell Finley," she said, in a voice that was calm and absolutely steady, "that I have already deposited copies of all my correspondence with him, along with a detailed accounting of his scheme, with the county land office, with the circuit court clerk, and with the editor of the Garrison's Creek Gazette. If anything happens to me, those documents become a full inquiry. Tell him that is the only conversation he and I will ever have." The 2 men looked at each other. People who rely on intimidation generally expect fear as the response, and the absence of it tends to produce a particular kind of uncertain recalibration. They left. She finished watering her horse and walked back to her house at her normal pace. She told Matthew about it the following morning because he had a right to know that Finley's grudge had the potential to touch his partnership, and because she was not the kind of person who kept relevant information from someone who had a stake in her safety. Matthew's face went through several changes as she spoke. By the end of them, his jaw was set in a way she had not seen before, not the deliberate set of someone choosing their words carefully, but the hard, tightened set of someone controlling a reaction that had significant energy behind it. "Did they touch you?" he asked. "No." He was quiet. Then he got up from the fence post where he had been sitting and walked to the eastern boundary of the field and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she understood he was giving himself time to bring whatever was moving through him back under control. When he turned around, his voice was level. "I know Finley's people. They work for a man named Cass Decker who runs cattle on the west side of the county and has been trying to consolidate land on this side for 2 years. Finley is Decker's instrument." "That explains the scale of the scheme," Theresa said. "He was not just collecting small amounts from out-of-state buyers. He was building a case to argue purchase right on lands with unclear title." Matthew stared at her. "How did you arrive at that?" "The specific parcels he advertised were all properties with disputed survey lines or estates in probate. I looked them up at the land office before I confronted him. He kept looking at her with that expression, the one she had first seen on the morning she met him in the field, the look of a man whose assumptions were being revised against their will by the evidence in front of him. But this time there was something warmer in it, something that was not just reluctant respect but genuine admiration, the kind that moves in a person and changes the landscape of how they see someone. You had already mapped out his entire operation before you walked into his office, Matthew said slowly. It seemed wise to know what I was walking into. A sound came out of him that was a full laugh, not the almost laugh she had heard before. It changed his face dramatically. The lines around his eyes deepened. The set of his mouth opened into something easy and unguarded, and she had the strange sensation of seeing, for the first time, the man he had been before 5 years of grief had layered over him. "What do you suggest we do about Decker?" he asked. "Take the documented evidence to the circuit judge before Decker can make a move. The land office copies are already there, but a formal legal claim filed by the affected landowners would shut down whatever Decker and Finley are planning before it reaches the point of being a real problem." Matthew nodded slowly, thinking it through. "I will talk to the Hendersons and the Marsh family. They are the other large landholders on this side of the county. If we go to the circuit judge together, the case is stronger." "Agreed," Theresa said. He looked at her for a long moment, and neither of them spoke, and the morning air was warm and smelled of turned earth and new wheat just beginning to push up through the soil, and the south field was alive in a way it had not been in 5 years. "You are not what I expected when I came over this ridge 3 weeks ago," he said. "I know," she said. "You expected empty ground." "I expected a lot of things I did not find." He paused. "I am not sure yet what I did find." She held his gaze steadily. "I think you are sure enough," she said, and picked up her spade and went back to work. The meeting with the circuit judge took place 2 weeks later, and it unfolded largely as Theresa had predicted. The combined testimony of Matthew, the Henderson family, and the Marsh family, supported by the documented evidence from the land office, established a clear pattern of fraudulent misrepresentation on Finley's part. The judge issued an order requiring Finley to vacate the county within 48 hours and referred the matter to the state land office for further review of any transactions Decker may have been party to. Finley left. Decker retreated, for the moment, though Matthew had no illusions that the man's ambitions had changed. What had changed, in the weeks following the hearing, was something that could not be documented or filed at a land office and had no legal standing at all. It had happened gradually, and then with a sudden acceleration that surprised them both, the easy rhythm of partnership had quietly become something that neither of them had named but both of them felt. Theresa rode out to the south field every morning, and Matthew was always there, always working, and the conversations between them had spread outward from the practical and agricultural into a wider territory. She had told him about her father's journals, about growing up in Missouri, about the way a particular kind of clear autumn light over a field of harvested corn looked like the color of contentment itself. He had told her about growing up on this land, about the way his father had treated the soil as a conversation partner, about what it had been like to learn the ranch as a boy following Matthew Garrett through the fields with the absolute faith that a child gives to a parent who has earned it. He had not talked to anyone about his father for 5 years. He did not fully understand, until the words were already out, how much he had needed to. It was in late April that the young wheat in the south field pushed up its first true leaves, and Theresa had knelt in the middle of the field at dawn to look at them fine, green, irreducibly alive. And when she looked up, Matthew was watching her from 10 feet away with an expression that was so unguarded it made her throat tight. "He would have been glad to see this," he said quietly. "My father." "I know he would," she said. He knelt down beside her in the wheat row, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air, and he looked at the young plants with a look she recognized as the thing that had been locked behind the gate with the field itself. The love of this earth that was his inheritance, that grief had made too painful to feel for 5 whole seasons. "Thank you," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the wheat, at the living field, but the words were entirely for her. Her chest was full of something she did not have an immediate word for, some combination of tenderness and recognition, and the particular clarity that comes when you understand that something has permanently shifted in your life. She put her hand over his in the row of wheat, and he turned his over and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the field was alive all around them, and the morning light was as clear and direct as everything they had been discovering about each other. He walked her back to her horse at noon, as he sometimes did, and this time at the gate he did not immediately step back. He stood close to her with his hand on the gate post and looked at her with the directness that was the most distinctively him thing about him, the quality that made him incapable of pretending. "I want to take you to supper," he said, "at the hotel restaurant, not as a matter of business." "I know it would not be business," she said. "Is that a yes?" She considered him for a moment. His shirt was dusty from the morning's work. His dark hair was disordered under the pushed-back brim of his hat. He was looking at her with a combination of vulnerability and steadiness that was, she thought, the most appealing thing she had ever seen in a human face. "Saturday evening," she said. 7 o'clock, he smiled. It was not the sudden, surprised laugh she had seen before, but something quieter and more settled, the smile of a man who has been cold for a long time and has just stepped into warmth. Saturday evening arrived with a pink and gold sunset over the hill country that seemed to have been arranged with theatrical intent. Theresa put on her best dress, which was a deep green that her mother had always said suited her, and pinned her hair with more care than she generally bothered with, and walked to the hotel restaurant at 5 minutes to 7 to find Matthew already there, cleaned up and in his good shirt, talking to the hotel owner in a way that stopped when he saw her come through the door. The expression on his face when he saw her was one she would remember for the rest of her life. They ate supper at a table by the window while the sky outside moved through its colors, and they talked for 2.5 hours with the ease of people who have already discovered that their minds fit together well, and are now discovering that the rest of them fits too. He told her things he had not told anyone about the morning he found his father, about the year that followed it, about the specific quality of the loneliness that comes when you have inherited something that was built in partnership and must now be continued alone. She told him about the things she had been afraid of when she left Missouri, not the journey, not the frontier, not Finley or his sort, but the quieter fear of arriving somewhere and finding that what she knew had no place to land. "It landed," he said simply. "It did," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and this time it was not a field with wheat seedlings between them. It was a table with 2 empty dessert plates and a lamp and the warm, close space of a room where a specific kind of evening was unfolding. "I have been very careful," he said, "for a long time, about everything, about this kind of thing especially." "I can see that," she said. "I'm going to stop being careful about this particular thing," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I am glad you are being clear," she said. He walked her home that night under a sky so thick with stars it was almost audible, and at her door he held both her hands and looked at her in the dark and the starlight and said, "Theresa Alden, I did not know what I was letting into my field." "Yes, you did," she said. "You had the choice to stop it and you did not." "No," he said softly. "I did not." And he kissed her once with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the size and force of him, and it was the kind of kiss that establishes something, that puts a stake in the ground. May arrived, and with it a warmth that brought the south field up in earnest row upon row of winter wheat climbing toward full stalk height, the irrigation running smooth along the channel that Matthew had rebuilt, and Theresa maintained with precise timing, the whole field showing a health and a color that the older hands on the Garrett spread had not seen from that ground in years. Word got around the county, as word always does. The South Field becoming productive again was not a small thing in Garrison's Creek. It was a sign of something, though people read the sign differently depending on their disposition. Some of the older ranchers' wives read it as a sign of a particular kind of healing, which it was. Some of the younger men read it as a sign of a particular kind of partnership, which it also was. The Gazette ran a brief notice about the agricultural cooperation arrangement and mentioned Theresa's methods with more accuracy than Theresa had expected from a frontier newspaper, because she had spoken with the editor directly and given him correct terminology. She and Matthew had fallen into a pattern that was simultaneously professional and entirely personal, and the boundary between those two things was becoming increasingly academic. They worked the South Field together mornings, and she spent afternoons at the northern pasture working on the aeration project she had proposed, and 3 evenings a week he appeared at her door and took her to supper or for an evening ride along the county road when the air was cool. The town had reached a consensus that was warmer than she had initially expected, and the dissenting voices had become quieter as the practical evidence of what she was accomplishing on the Garrett land became harder to argue with. It was in early June that Cass Decker made his second move. It was not through Finley this time. Finley was gone, and Decker was not a man who made the same mistake twice. What Decker did this time was direct. He rode to the Garrett spread himself, with 2 of his ranch hands, on a Tuesday morning when Matthew was in town at the land office on an unrelated errand. He found Theresa at the South Field. Decker was a large man in his late 40s, prosperous in a way that was more about acquisition than about honest building, with a manner that had been refined over years into something that passed for civility on the surface while communicating threat underneath. He complimented the field. He asked about her origins. He mentioned, with what was clearly a prepared casualness, that he had heard she was operating under a temporary partnership agreement and that he hoped she had considered what her position would be when the agreement concluded. "My position will be exactly what I make it," Theresa said pleasantly, not stopping her work. Decker smiled. "A woman of your capability should have permanent security, a real stake, not a handshake arrangement with a grieving rancher." "The arrangement is a signed legal document," she said, "not a handshake, and Matthew Garrett is not grieving, he is working." Decker let the smile stay on his face, but his eyes shifted slightly. "I am prepared to offer you a genuine stake in this county's future, real land, real ownership, not borrowed ground." She straightened up from the row she had been working and looked at him directly. "You are suggesting I desert a partner who has treated me fairly and given me opportunity in exchange for land that you want to use me to get access to." Decker's smile finally left. "That is an uncharitable reading. It is an accurate reading. You want leverage on the Garrett spread, and you think I am the leverage." She looked at the 2 ranch hands flanking him, who were now studying the middle distance with elaborate neutrality. "Tell me I am wrong." She was not wrong, and Decker knew she was not wrong, and the moment stretched out between them with an unpleasant clarity. "You are making an enemy," he said. "You made yourself my enemy when you funded Finley's scheme and targeted this land," she said. "I did not make the initial choice. I am only responding to it." Decker pulled his horse around and rode out with his hands behind him, and Theresa watched him go and then picked up her spade and went back to her row. She told Matthew that evening at supper, and this time his reaction was different from the first time. Controlled anger was there, but it moved differently. It was the anger of a man who has someone specific to be angry on behalf of, and the distinction was visible. "He will not come back to the field," Matthew said. "That was a fishing expedition. He was testing whether you could be turned." "I could not," Theresa said. "He will know that now." Matthew looked at his coffee for a moment. "He will look for another angle. He generally does." "What is the other angle?" "He will try the legal route again. He has been pushing the county commission about water rights on the west fork of Garrison's Creek. If he can get a ruling on the creek, he can restrict irrigation water to the east side of the county." Theresa thought about this for a moment, following the logic of it. "The South Field Channel," she said. The Southfield Channel draws from a tributary of the West Fork. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. The water rights law in Texas at this time, the prior appropriation doctrine, allows first use to establish right. When was the original channel on the Southfield built? Matthew looked at her. 1861. My father built it in the first year he had the land. Then the Garrett claim would predate any claim Decker could file, but you would need documentation. Original survey records showing the channel and its date of construction. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. The original land survey records from 1861 would be at the State Land Office in Austin, he said slowly. But my father kept copies. He was meticulous about documentation. He paused. They would be in his files at the house. You have not looked through his files, she said. It was not quite a question. No, he said simply. She looked at him with the same steadiness she always offered him. We need those documents before Decker gets his motion to the commission. How much time do we have? The commission meets in 3 weeks. Then we need to look through the files. Another pause. Then, would you come with me to go through them? She understood what he was asking. Yes, she said. Of course. The following morning, Theresa rode to the Garrett house for the first time. It was a substantial house for the frontier, 2 stories, built from local limestone that had weathered to a warm gold, with a covered porch running its full front length and a kitchen garden to the east side that needed attention but had the bones of something that had once been well tended. Matthew met her on the porch and opened the door with a key that he held like something heavy. Samuel Garrett's study was a room at the back of the house that Matthew had clearly not opened recently. The air in it had the specific quality of undisturbed time, and every surface was neat and ordered in a way that spoke of a particular kind of man, a man who knew where everything was, who valued precision, who built things intended to last. Theresa felt the weight of the room and said nothing. She stood at the doorway and waited for Matthew to lead. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment looking at his father's desk. Then he went to the cabinet against the east wall and began to look through the files methodically, with the careful, controlled movements of someone who is managing something internal with great deliberateness. She went to help. They worked through the files together, and she let the silence be what it was, and 40 minutes in. Matthew pulled a folder from the back of the lower cabinet and spread it open on the desk, and there were the original survey documents. 1861, witnessed and sealed, clearly delineating the irrigation channel from the creek tributary with the dates of original construction. He stood at the desk looking at the documents for a long moment. He was always prepared, Matthew said quietly, for every possible argument someone might make against what he had built. He knew that building something meant defending it. You are the same, Theresa said. He looked at her. I let the Southfield go. You were grieving. That is different from being unprepared. You have protected everything else. She paused. And you opened the gate when it mattered. You opened the gate, he said. I just did not stop you. That is the same thing sometimes, she said gently. He looked at her, and the documents were between them on his father's desk, and the room was full of the weight of everything that had happened in this house and on this land. And he reached across the desk and put his hand along her jaw, and his thumb traced her cheekbone with a gentleness that was startling from a man with hands that size, and she stood entirely still and let him look at her. I love you, he said. He said it the way he did most things, directly, without preamble, without qualification. I did not expect to say that to anyone again. I want you to know what it means when I say it. She covered his hand with hers against her face. I know what it means, she said. I love you too. He exhaled, and it was the sound of something long held releasing, and then he came around the desk and held her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him and felt the specific rightness of it. The way 2 things fit together when they are built from compatible material and have found their proper angle. They stood in his father's study for a while, and then they took the survey documents to the table and made careful copies in Theresa's clear handwriting. And then they rode together to the land office and filed the documentation establishing the prior appropriation claim on the Southfield's water rights. And that was both a practical act and an act of love, and the two things were not distinguishable from each other. The county commission meeting was 3 weeks later, and Decker's attorney made his case for a new water rights allocation on the West Fork, with the assurance of a man who has not expected opposition. The attorney presenting the Garrett claim, a sharp young man from San Antonio named Voss, who Matthew had retained on Theresa's advice, laid out the 1861 documentation with meticulous care. The commission took 40 minutes to deliberate and ruled in favor of the existing prior appropriation claims. Decker's face in the hearing room was very instructive. Theresa studied it from her seat beside Matthew and read in it the specific calculus of a man revising his available options. He would not be done, but this particular avenue was closed. After the hearing, walking out into the bright June afternoon, Matthew took her hand in public for the first time, right there on the courthouse steps, in front of half the population of Garrison's Creek who had come to watch the hearing. The town saw it and registered it with the collective attentiveness of a community that has been waiting for exactly this development. Martha Colville, who was standing with two other women near the courthouse gate, said, "Well, finally," loudly enough for several people to hear, and a ripple of amusement moved through the crowd. Theresa felt the warmth of Matthew's hand around hers and did not let herself look as pleased as she felt, but only barely. The summer moved through its heat with the specific intensity of a Texas hill country June and July, and the South field grew and ripened with a steadiness that told anyone who knew how to read wheat that the season was going to be extraordinary. Theresa managed the irrigation timing and the pest monitoring with her usual precision, and Matthew contributed the infrastructure support and the labor, and an increasingly intimate knowledge of her methods that was beginning to make her evaluations and his instincts converge. She moved through the work days with a contentment she had not anticipated when she left Missouri. The frontier had the reputation of being a place that broke people, and she had known before she came that it asked a high price for its particular brand of possibility. What she had not calculated for was finding someone on this land whose way of engaging with the world matched her own in the essential respects: the commitment to honest labor, the respect for what the earth could do if you worked with it rather than against it, the directness of speaking plainly and meaning what you said. She had also not calculated for the way that loving someone on their own land, in the fields where their history lived, could deepen the love into something different from what she had known before. She loved Matthew Garrett, and she loved him specifically here in this place, in a way that had grown roots in the same ground as the winter wheat. In late July, she received a letter from her brother Daniel in Missouri. He wrote carefully, with the tact of someone choosing words around a subject he was uncertain of. He had heard she was doing well in Texas. He hoped she was comfortable. He mentioned, gently, that the Missouri farm was working out well for the family, and that if she ever found herself wanting to come back, there was room. She sat with the letter for an evening and then wrote back. She wrote that she was doing extraordinarily well. She wrote that the Texas soil was unlike Missouri soil in several specific and interesting ways, and that the agricultural challenges of the hill country were among the most stimulating she had encountered. She wrote that she had a partnership that was going to expand in the coming season. And then she wrote, clearly and without drama, that she was in love with a man named Matthew Garrett, and that she believed she was going to spend her life on his land. She sealed the letter and sent it and felt, in the doing of it, the particular solidity of a decision that has moved from feeling to certainty. She told Matthew about the letter that evening on the porch of his house, where they had fallen into the habit of sitting in the cool of the evening after a long day. He listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of him, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment. "You told your brother you were going to spend your life here," he said. "I did. That is a significant thing to tell someone. I know it is." He turned to look at her in the evening light, and his face had the open, unguarded quality she had come to associate with the times he was about to say something important. "Then we should formalize it," he said. "If you are willing." She looked at him steadily. "Ask me properly and I will tell you if I am willing." He set down his coffee cup and turned fully toward her on the porch steps, this large, dark, direct man who had opened his father's field again because she had shown him it was still breathing, who had stood in the room of his grief and chosen to come out of it. "Theresa Alden," he said, "I would like you to marry me. I would like this to be your land as much as it is mine. I would like to build something here the way my father built something here, with intention, with permanence, with someone who is my equal in every respect." He paused. "I would also like you to know that I am asking because I want to, and not because the county gossip has made it seem necessary. And I would like you to say yes because you want to and not for any other reason." She was, for what might have been the first time in her adult life, briefly without an immediate response. The quality of what he had said, the precision of it, the respect in it, the very specific acknowledgement of her equality that he had placed at the center of the question, had moved through her in a way that required a moment. "Yes," she said. "All of that, yes." He kissed her on the porch in the evening light, and it was not the tentative, establishing kiss of their first one on the doorstep in April. It was longer and warmer, and had in it the certainty of two people who have committed to the same direction. They were married in the Methodist Church on a Saturday in September, in a ceremony that Theresa had planned with characteristic efficiency, and Matthew had contributed to with characteristic directness, resulting in a service that was beautiful without being excessive and personal without being theatrical. The Reverend was warm and genuine, the church was full, and Martha Colville cried, which was apparently something she was known to do at every wedding in the county, but which felt particularly meaningful this time. The south field had been harvested the week before the wedding. The yield was everything Theresa had projected, more than everything, because the fallow years had left the soil with a stored richness that amplified the careful planting. The surplus was significant. It covered the northern pasture's shortfall and filled the granary, and left enough for trade that Matthew was able to pay off the remaining note on the property that had been outstanding since a lean year in 1880. He told her this the evening of the harvest with a matter-of-factness that did not quite conceal how much it meant. "Your father's field paid the note," she said. "Our field paid the note," he said. After the wedding, Theresa moved into the limestone house, and the kitchen garden to the east side of the house became, within 2 weeks, visibly different, properly turned, properly amended, properly planned in the rotation system she had applied to every piece of ground she touched. Matthew watched her transform it from the kitchen window one morning, and felt the specific, renewable satisfaction of being with someone who brings life to every piece of ground they walk on. The second season on the Garrett land was planned over the winter evenings at the kitchen table, with Theresa's charts and Matthew's knowledge of the local weather patterns combining into something better than either of them could have produced alone. They planned not only the South Field's second season, but an expansion into a western pasture that had been used only for light grazing, and had the soil profile, Theresa determined, for a strong corn rotation. Cass Decker made one more attempt in the autumn of their first married year, a quiet legal maneuver through an associate in the county commission that tried to challenge the original land survey boundaries of the Garrett property. Matthew and Theresa addressed it methodically, through the same combination of thorough documentation and clear legal argument that had worked before. The case was dismissed. Decker went quiet, and the silence from that direction had, over the following year, the quality of a permanent withdrawal. Winter was a time of its own kind of fullness. The house was warm, the evenings were long, and the specific intimacy of being housebound together through the cold months developed between them, a layer of knowing that was different from what the Fields had built. Matthew was, in his private life, as in his professional one, a person without hidden motives or secret agendas, and this quality, which she had valued as a partner, was something that she found she loved as a spouse in a particular and daily way. He read, which had surprised her when she first discovered it, not newspapers, though he read those too, but books, real books, volumes of history and natural science, and the occasional novel that he got from the lending library that a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Park maintained in her house on Oak Street. She had found him reading a geological survey of the southern plains one evening and had asked about it, and the conversation had gone on for 2 hours. She contributed her father's agricultural journals to the household library, having finally unpacked the box she had brought from Missouri, and she and Matthew spent several winter evenings reading them together, and those evenings were among the most quietly precious ones she could remember, sitting beside him in the lamplight with her father's handwriting making a bridge between Missouri and Texas, between the man who had made her who she was and the man who loved who she was. By the following spring, she knew she was expecting their first child. She told Matthew on a morning when the south field was being prepared for its second planting, when the earth had been opened again, and the smell of it was the smell of everything they had built, and he went entirely still for a moment and then picked her up, both hands around her waist, and lifted her off the ground with the careless ease of a man for whom this was physically effortless, and she laughed, a real, full, unguarded laugh. And he set her down and held her face, and looked at her with an expression so full of joy and love, and a wonder that she thought his face might not be large enough to contain it. "A father," he said, still holding her face. "I did not know how much I wanted that. I suspected," she said, "the way you are with the Henderson children at church. I did not think it was that obvious." "It was entirely obvious," she said, and kissed him. The child was a boy, born in December of 1884, after a labor that Theresa managed with the same focused practicality she brought to every difficulty, and that Matthew endured from the adjacent room with rather less composure, according to Mrs. Colville, who attended the birth along with the county doctor. They named him Samuel James, Samuel for Matthew's father, James for Theresa's. It was a name that held both histories in it, that made a bridge between them in the same way the South Field had, in the same way the agricultural journals had, in the same way every act of opening and planting and growing made a bridge between what had been and what was becoming. Samuel James Garrett arrived in the world with a considerable amount of strong-lunged opinion about the process, and then settled, once held, into the specific contentment of a person who has arrived where they belong. Matthew held him in the lamplight while Theresa rested, and the expression on his face was one she watched from the bed with a full heart, the expression of a man who has come back from a long absence and discovered that arrival was even better than the journey. The South Field went into its third season as the spring of 1885 arrived. It was established now, its rhythms integrated into the Garrett Ranch's operations, its place in the rotation clear and productive. The irrigation channel that Matthew had rebuilt ran clean every season. The yield figures from the first 2 harvests had been documented and shared, at Theresa's insistence, with the county agricultural extension agent, who was beginning to bring new scientific farming methods to the region, and her numbers had become a reference point in the county for what properly managed dryland wheat could produce. She continued to teach, informally, wherever she found opportunity, at the schoolhouse when Prager asked her back, which he did regularly, and at the quarterly meetings of the County Agricultural Association, which had begun to invite her after the second season's results. She was one of very few women in these rooms, and the initial resistance from some quarters had been worn down by the straightforward evidence of her competence, which was the only argument she had ever thought worth making. She taught her methods because she believed knowledge should spread. She had gotten her knowledge from her father, who had gotten it from journals and experiments, and the stubborn conviction that farming could be improved by thought and study. She passed it forward with the same conviction, and she saw it take root in other fields around the county, and that satisfaction was its own kind of harvest. Matthew's ranch expanded steadily over the following years, not through acquisition of other people's land, but through the improvement of what they had. The Western Pastures corn rotation proved as productive as Theresa had projected. The Northern Pastures alfalfa stand recovered after the cover crop rotation and produced better yields than it had in years. The ranch as a whole moved from comfortable into genuinely prosperous, which meant that the improvements that had been deferred during the lean years could be made: a new barn, better fencing on the eastern boundary, a proper root cellar, and an expansion of the kitchen garden that became, under Theresa's management, something that supplied not just the household but regular donations to the church's community table. Samuel grew through his babyhood and early childhood with the intensity and curiosity that seemed to be his birthright from both sides. Theresa's analytical attention and Matthew's physical directness combined in a small person who climbed everything he could reach and then asked intelligent questions about what he had seen from the top. He followed his parents through the fields with the absolute trust of a child who has been given adults worth trusting, and he learned the South Field the way Matthew had once learned it, following his own father through presence, through attention, through the accumulated daily evidence that soil was alive and worth caring for. In the spring of 1887, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Ruth, after Matthew's mother and Theresa's grandmother. She arrived with somewhat more equanimity than Samuel had shown about the same process, and she turned out to be a quiet, watchful, deeply perceptive child who observed everything and spoke when she had something specific to say, which Theresa recognized immediately as her father's disposition with her mother's precision. The year Clara was born was also the year that Matthew's relationship with the South Field completed its transition from something he endured to something he loved again. It had been moving in that direction since the first morning he had stood in the turned rows and been unable to make himself send Theresa away. But there is a difference between returning to something painful and making peace with it, and the peace had come slowly, over seasons, the way things in fields grow, beneath the surface long before they are visible. He told her about it one evening in the late summer of that year, sitting on the porch after the children were asleep, with the stars over the hill country doing the extravagant thing they did in August. "I went to the spot today," he said. She knew which spot he meant. "I go sometimes when I am working that section. I have been going since the second season." He paused. Today it was not painful in the way it was. She waited. "It was like he was there," he said. "Like the field itself is where he is, not the grief of it, the good part. The part where we built the irrigation channel together when I was 11. He stopped again. "I think I needed you to open it before I could find that." She reached for his hand in the dark. "He would have loved you," Matthew said. He was very clear-eyed about people, and he respected capability above everything else. "He would have loved you immediately." "I would have loved him," she said. "Any man who built what he built and raised who he raised, I would have loved him immediately." Matthew held her hand and they sat in the August night, and the stars did their extravagant August thing, and the South Field was out there in the dark, breathing, alive, doing what it had been capable of all along, waiting only for someone to open it again. The years that followed were full in the way of lives well built. The partnership agreement that had been drawn at the land office in Garrison's Creek was superseded by the permanent joining of the marriage, and Theresa's name was added to the Garrett land deed in 1886. Her idea, practically proposed, with the full legal standing that she believed she had earned and Matthew agreed she had, the only question being why it had not been done sooner. Cass Decker sold his West Side operation in 1888 to a cattle company from Abilene and left the county, a departure that produced no visible grief in anyone Theresa could identify. The wider world moved through its particular late 1880s turbulence. The cattle boom and its contraction, the railroad's expanding reach, the slow transformation of the frontier into something that was becoming a region with institutions and permanence. Garrison's Creek grew, not dramatically but steadily, and the things that had been provisional about it, the shared church, the single schoolroom, the land office that served 3 counties from one building, became more solid. The Garrett Ranch grew with it, and Theresa grew with it, and she was known across the county for what she had done with the South Field, and for what that had spread outward, a kind of practical agricultural science brought to ground that had not had it before, methods that improved yields and restored land that had been worn out or simply never properly understood. She was 41 years old when the County Agricultural Association asked her to present at a state conference in Austin. She had made that journey with Matthew, leaving the children in the capable care of Mrs. Park and her daughter, and she had stood in a room of mostly men and spoken with the plain authority of someone who has the numbers and knows how to read them and does not need anyone else's permission to say so. She had been the only woman presenting. She had also been the most referenced presenter in the discussion that followed. Matthew, sitting in the back of that conference room, had felt something he identified precisely: pride. Not the conditional pride that asks something in return, but the specific pride of watching someone you love fully inhabiting what they are capable of. He told her so that evening at the hotel where they were staying, in a room with gas lighting and a proper bathtub, which felt like a remarkable luxury after a decade in the hill country. "You were extraordinary today," he said. She looked at him from across the room with an expression that was partly genuine modesty and partly the look she gave him when she thought he was being generous beyond the available evidence. "I was competent," she said. "You were extraordinary," he repeated. "I know what those other men know, and you knew more of it than any of them. That is not politeness. That is an accurate observation from a reasonably qualified observer." She looked at him for a moment, and the look softened into something warmer. "You are the most genuinely respectful man I have ever known," she said. "I am also right," he said. She laughed. "You are also right," she allowed. They came home from Austin to a ranch running smoothly in their absence, to children who greeted them with the competitive energy of people who have been very patient for several days, and are now out of patience, to the South Field in full late-season form, to the kitchen garden heavy with September produce, to the limestone house with its covered porch and its kitchen with the long table where the family ate, and where the agricultural journals lived, and where on winter evenings the lamp made a warm circle in which life had accumulated into something real. The 1890s arrived and brought with them some difficulties. A dry summer in 1891 that tested every rancher in the county. A dip in cattle prices in 1893 that pinched the operation's margins. The ordinary challenges of sustaining a working ranch across a decade. And Theresa and Matthew met all of it the same way they had met everything, which was with the combination of her knowledge and his strength, and both their wills, and the specific advantage of 2 people who communicate well. Samuel, by the time he was 12, was following his mother through the South Field the way his grandfather had once been followed by his father, asking the same kind of questions and getting them answered with the same thoroughness. He had his mother's mind and his father's patience for hard work, and the combination was promising in a way that made both of them quietly glad. Clara developed an attachment to the cattle operation that surprised everyone, including herself, discovering at around age 9 that she had an instinct for animal husbandry that was as strong and specific as her mother's instinct for soil. And this was welcomed and encouraged, and she grew up splitting her attention between the fields and the herd in a way that was perfectly suited to the ranch that the Garrett spread had become. When Matthew was 50 and Theresa was 47, they celebrated 20 years of the Southfield's reclamation with a supper that brought together neighbors and friends, and the people who had been part of the life they had built. The Hendersons and the Marsh family, the Colvilles and the Voss family, old Pete Harlow, who was still alive and still conducting town business with an energy that was remarkable, and Mrs. Park, who had brought every book she had ever lent them as a sort of anniversary reference. Matthew stood on the porch that evening and looked out across the land in the August dusk, with the fields visible in the softening light, the south field among them, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had been built honestly and had held what it was built to hold. Theresa came to stand beside him, as she had on so many evenings, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood looking at the land together in the way they always had, the way of people who share a common vision of a thing and see it in the same light. 20 years, she said. 20 years since you trespassed on my field, he said. I prefer to think of it as applied optimism, she said. He tightened his arm around her and she felt the warmth of him, still steady, still the same solid warmth that had been there since the first morning she had seen him come down off the ridge in a fury that turned into something else entirely. Applied optimism, he repeated. Is that what you call what happened? She looked up at him in the dusk. I call it the best decision I ever made, she said, without qualification. He looked at her, and his face in the August light had the lines of 50 years of living in it, and the expression it wore was the same one that had been moving beneath the surface since the first morning in the field. The expression of a man who has been handed something better than he thought was possible, and has spent 20 years being grateful for it. He kissed her there on the porch in the dusk, with their guests behind them in the house, and their children somewhere in the yard, and the south field breathing in the evening air. And it was the kiss of two people who have chosen each other across 20 years and would choose each other again tomorrow, and every day after that without hesitation or reserve. Inside the house, Samuel was telling Clara something about soil nitrogen with the lecturing confidence of a 14-year-old who has recently become certain he knows everything. And Clara was tolerating it with the patience of an 11-year-old who is already calculating when it will be strategic to deploy what she actually knows. And the house was warm and full, and loud with the specific music of a family that has taken root. The south field was out there in the dark, all 50 acres of it, as alive and productive as it had been in Samuel Garrett's best year, maybe more so, the result of 20 seasons of careful management, of the irrigation channel that ran clear and steady, of the rotation system that kept the soil balanced and deep, of the accumulated knowledge and love that had been turned into it season after season. It had been fallow for 5 years when Theresa Alden had come over the ridge with a borrowed spade and seed bags from Missouri, and the particular kind of optimism that believes a rested field is not a dead one. It had been closed off behind the weight of a grief that a son had carried alone in the only way he had known how to carry it. She had opened it before he could explain why he had stopped. And what she had found underneath the silence was not just mineral-rich soil and stored nitrogen and years of accumulated potential. What she had found, working its way up through the dark like everything that grows, was a man still capable of being reached, still capable of growing toward light, still capable of loving something as fiercely and permanently as his father had taught him to love this land. Matthew Garrett came back inside that evening and found his wife at the kitchen table with Mrs. Park, talking about the expansion of the county library. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, the clear dark eyes, the confident set of her shoulders, the way she held herself with the self-possession of someone who has always known exactly what she is worth, and felt the same thing he had felt since the first morning, the recognition of something essential, something that had arrived in his field at dawn with a borrowed spade and changed the direction of his life completely. She looked up and saw him watching her, and the expression on her face was one she reserved for him alone, warm and direct, and very slightly amused, the look of someone who knows she is loved and returns it in full measure. He came to the table and sat beside her and put his hand over hers, and the conversation continued around them, and the night settled over the Garrett ranch, over the limestone house and the kitchen garden and the south field and the west pasture, and the whole 6,000 acres of land that they had tended together into something better than it had been, and the stars came out over the hill country in their extravagant abundance, and the world was full,